Joan of Arc, one of the most iconic figures in history, was born in a small village called Domremy in France in 1412. It was a time when France was in the middle of the 100 Years' War with England, and the country was in turmoil. Joan's parents were Jacques d'Arc and Isabelle Romay, just simple farmers at the time. They were both deeply rooted in the rural life of their village, Domremy, in northeastern France. Jacques d'Arc, Joan's father, was a farmer by trade. He was well respected in the community. As a farmer, he also owned some lands and served as a local official, adding to his influence in the village. He was known to be a hardworking man, someone who valued tradition and the well-being of his family above all. Jacques was a practical person, and like many at the time, he was likely concerned with the everyday struggles of rural life, such as managing the farm and ensuring his family was provided for. Isabelle Romay, Joan's mother, played a notable role in shaping Joan's character, especially her deep religious faith. Isabelle was a devout Catholic and instilled these values in her children from a young age. Joan was known from a young age for her strong sense of duty and faith. Although she had no formal education and couldn't read or write, she was deeply spiritual. Like any other peasant girl, she spent a lot of time helping around the house and in the fields, but something about her was different. Joan was one of several children, and like her siblings, she had responsibilities at a young age. She helped her parents with the farm work, tending to the animals, and working in the fields. Life in Domremy was simple, and Joan's early years were filled with the routines of village life. However, she was taught the essential skills needed to manage a household, and her mother, Isabelle, made sure Joan knew her prayers and understood the importance of their faith. The village of Domremy was on the border of two regions that were often caught up in the conflict between France and England during the 100 Years' War, and so Joan grew up in a time of great uncertainty and hardship. The war affected everyone, and there were times when Joan's village came under threat from marauding soldiers. Around 13, something phenomenal happened. Joan began to experience what she described as visions. She claimed that saints like Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret spoke to her. At first, these visions were comforting, but soon they became more urgent. The saints told her she had a special mission to help save France from its enemies and ensure that Charles, the Dauphin of France, was crowned king. These visions were extraordinary, especially for a young girl from a small village, setting Joan apart from others. She went from being a simple farm girl to becoming a leader and a symbol of hope for her country, driven by the belief that God chose her for a divine purpose. This must have seemed unbelievable to a young girl living in a small village far from the grand cities and battlefields. Yet Joan believed these visions were real and felt compelled to follow them. Her life changed dramatically after Joan of Arc began experiencing visions around 13. At first, Joan kept these experiences to herself, likely unsure how to act on them. But as time passed, the urgency of her mission grew stronger. By the time she was 17, Joan could no longer ignore the call she felt from her visions. She decided she had to take action, even though it was unheard of for a young peasant girl to think she could influence the course of a war. But feeling so determined, she left her village of Domremy and traveled to the nearby commune in France, where she sought out Robert de Baudricourt, the local commander. Joan asked him to take her to Dauphin Charles and then China. At first, Baudricourt didn't take Joan seriously. It was hard to imagine that this young girl could be anything more than a curiosity. However, Joan's persistence and the rumors of her visions convinced people that there might be something special about her. After a few attempts, Baudricourt finally agreed to send her to Charles, though it was likely more to get rid of her than anything else. Joan's journey to meet Charles was dangerous. France was still under the 100 Years' War, and the roads were unsafe. But Joan made it to China, where she finally met Charles. When she arrived, Joan was not immediately granted an audience. Charles and his advisors were skeptical. They needed to be sure she wasn't some trick or a madwoman. Charles is said to have disguised himself among his courtiers to test her, but Joan immediately recognized him, which made a strong impression. She told him God sent her to help him reclaim his throne and save France. This was a bold claim, but it came at a time when Charles and his supporters were desperate for any sign of hope. Intrigued by her conviction and possibly swayed by the idea that she might be sent by divine providence, Charles eventually put Joan to the test. Before he allowed her to take action, he had theologians and church officials examine her. They questioned her thoroughly about her visions and her intentions. To their surprise, Joan's answers were clear, consistent, and sincere. They couldn't find any evidence that she was anything but genuine. Convinced that she was acting in good faith, Charles allowed Joan to lead a small army to the city of New Orleans, which was under siege by the English. It was a huge gamble, entrusting military leadership to a teenage girl with no formal training, but Charles had little to lose, and in truth, the morale of his troops was low. In 1429, Joan arrived at New Orleans with a small force. Wearing armor and carrying a banner, she inspired the French soldiers with unwavering faith. She was just 17 years old, yet she carried herself with the confidence of someone much older with a strong belief that she was on a mission from God. She was dressed in armor and riding a white horse, something unheard of for a young woman, and she carried a banner that bore the image of Christ and the words, Jesus Maria. Her presence alone was enough to boost the morale of the French troops, who had been demoralized after months of failed attempts to break the siege. When she reached the city, Joan was initially kept at a distance by some of the military leaders. They were cautious and not entirely convinced of her capabilities. However, her determination and the belief that she acted under divine guidance won them over. The people of Orleans were desperate for help, and Joan's arrival was a sign that they might still have a chance. She eventually took on a leadership role. She encouraged the French soldiers to be brave and led them in several skirmishes against the English. Her presence on the battlefield was inspiring, and she raised the spirits of the French troops. What was most remarkable was that Joan didn't just sit back and direct the battles. She actively participated. She carried a banner instead of a weapon, symbolizing her role as a figure of divine inspiration rather than a traditional warrior. One of Joan's first actions was leading a convoy of supplies into the city. This was crucial because the city was close to starvation. This successful delivery of these supplies gave the defenders a much-needed boost. In the days following her arrival, Joan led several attacks against the English fortifications surrounding Orleans. Her courage was undeniable, with an arrow even wounding her during one of the assaults, but yet she refused to leave the battlefield. Instead, she inspired the troops to push harder. Her presence seemed to turn the tide, and the French forces managed to capture key positions held by the English. On May 8, 1429, just 9 days after Joan's arrival, the siege of Orleans was lifted. The English forces, unable to hold their positions, retreated. This victory was a significant turning point in the war. It was the first major French victory in years and gave the French people renewed hope that they could drive the English out of their country. Joan's success at Orleans made her a national heroine almost overnight. The victory wasn't just a military triumph and a powerful symbol of French resilience and divine favor. It marked the beginning of a series of successes for the French, with Joan at the forefront, leading the charge. For Joan, the victory at Orleans validated the visions and voices she had heard since she was a young girl. It strengthened her belief that God indeed chose her to save France. For the people of France, she became the Maid of Orleans, a title that would follow her for the rest of her life and beyond. After the remarkable victory at Orleans, Joan of Arc's influence and reputation increased. The wind lifted the siege and significantly boosted the morale of the general populace. Joan was now seen as a symbol of divine favor, and her role in the war became even more central. Following the success at Orleans, Joan urged the Dauphin Charles and his military commanders to capitalize on the momentum. They launched what is known as the Loire Campaign, a series of battles aimed at driving the English out of the Loire Valley. Joan played a vital role in these battles, often leading the troops into combat and inspiring them with her presence. During this campaign, the French won several important victories, including the battles of Jargeau, Bégency, and Lotsmore. Joan's leadership was instrumental in these successes, and each triumph further cemented her reputation as a divinely guided leader. With the English forces weakened and the French spirits high, Joan turned her attention to her ultimate goal, ensuring that Charles was crowned as the legitimate king of France. She believed that Charles' coronation would be crucial in uniting France and securing its future. Joan convinced Charles and his advisors to march towards Reims, the traditional site for the coronation of French kings. This was a bold move, as Reims was deep in enemy territory. However, Joan's faith and determination were persuasive, and the campaign to Reims ensued. As the French army advanced, more towns and cities along the route surrendered without a fight, influenced by Joan's growing legend. And by the time they reached Reims, the path was clear. On July 17, 1429, in a grand ceremony at Reims Cathedral, Charles was crowned King Charles VII of France, with Joan standing proudly by his side, holding her banner. This moment fulfilled Joan's mission as she had understood it from her visions. After Charles VII was crowned king at Reims on July 17, 1429, all thanks mainly to Joan of Arc's efforts, France's political and military landscape began to shift, though not as rapidly as Joan might have hoped. Following the coronation, Joan believed her divine mission was not yet complete. She wanted to continue pushing the English out of France and reclaiming more territory, particularly Paris, under English control. However, after Charles became king, his priorities began to diverge from Joan's. Having achieved the symbolic victory of his coronation, Charles and his advisors were now more cautious. They were reluctant to risk further large-scale military campaigns, especially after the losses suffered during the attempted siege of Paris. Joan's role as an army leader diminished as the court started to distance itself from her bold strategies. Despite the court's reluctance, Joan attacked Paris in September 1429. The assault was poorly supported by the king's forces, reflecting his cautious approach and perhaps some internal resistance to Joan's growing influence. The attack was ultimately unsuccessful, and Joan was wounded during the battle. The failure in Paris was a significant blow to Joan's reputation and marked the beginning of her decline in influence at the French court. After the failed siege of Paris, Joan continued to campaign in northern France, but her successes were limited. Meanwhile, Charles VII focused on consolidating his power and negotiating with various factions within France. One of his significant achievements during this time was gradually weakening the alliance between the English and the Burgundians. The Duke of Burgundy, initially an ally of the English, began to see the advantage of aligning with Charles VII. This shift was critical in the eventual French victory in the Hundred Years' War, but came at the cost of Joan's influence. As the political landscape evolved, Joan's role as a military leader became less central. In May 1430, Joan was captured by the Burgundians during a battle near Compiègne. The Burgundians handed her over to the English, who were eager to eliminate the figurehead of the French resistance. Joan was imprisoned and taken to Rouen, where she was put on trial by a church court that the English controlled. The trial began in January 1431 and was a highly politicized affair. Joan was accused of heresy, witchcraft, and cross-dressing for wearing male military attire. Despite her courageous and astute defense, the outcome was predetermined. The English and their allies wanted to discredit Joan and undermine the legitimacy of Charles' coronation, which she had played a key role in securing. On May 30, 1431, Joan was found guilty and burned at the stake in Rouen. She was just 19 years old. Her execution was intended to demoralize the French, but instead it solidified her status as a martyr and a symbol of French resistance. After Joan's death, the war continued for another 2 decades. Although Joan was gone, her legacy and the momentum she had helped build persisted. Charles VII strengthened his position, eventually reconciling with the Duke of Burgundy 1435 through the Treaty of Arras, effectively isolating the English in France. The French military, now reformed and increasingly professional, began reclaiming territories the English held. By 1453, the Hundred Years' War ended with the French recapturing Bordeaux, leaving only Calais under English control. In 1456, the Catholic Church held a retrial to examine the charges against Joan. This retrial, authorized by Pope Calixtus II, overturned the original verdict, declaring Joan innocent and acknowledging that she had been a victim of political manipulation. Her name was cleared and she was recognized as a martyr. Joan's legacy indeed continued to grow over the centuries. In 1920, the Catholic Church canonized her as a saint. Today, Joan of Arc is remembered as one of France's most significant national heroes, symbolizing courage, faith, and the fight for justice. Her story continues to inspire people worldwide, standing as a testament to the impact one individual can have on the course of history. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and also subscribe to our YouTube channel to see more of what we have in store for you. And so, until next time.